Debt. Pretty much all countries in the world have it. Some more, some less, but what is it? The concept of national debt seems to have began during the late Middle Ages, when kings needed to borrow money to pay for their wars. In Europe, it all seems to start with the creation of the first central bank in England, an institution designed to lend to the government. It was initially created by William III of England for the financing of his war against France. Up to this point, kings could just not pay their debts, facing the consequences through revolt, declarations of war, not being able to borrow anymore in the future, or having to pay back lenders in means such as land or titles. With public bonds emitted by these central banks, debt managed to be maintained and eventually paid. In this video, we're going to do 5 simple things. 1. Understand in general what public debt is. 2. Find out which countries have the most and least debt. 3. How debt has evolved throughout modern time. 4. What causes a country's debt to increase or decrease. And 5. How government debt is paid. Today, public debt, also known as government debt, national debt, or sovereign debt, is the total amount of money owed by a country to its lenders. Every year, a country's government has a state budget of all the expenses and incomes the state will have in said year. If the expenses are more than the income, there will be a deficit, and the debt should go up. If the opposite situation happens, there is a surplus and the debt can go down. This is an oversimplification, of course. Even with a deficit, the debt can go down through renegotiations or variable interest rates, and even with a surplus, the debt might not go down if that surplus is used for something else. Debt can be divided into internal if the lenders are also within the country, or external if they are outside, but that is irrelevant for this video. In this video, all we want to know are the full figures and understand which countries in the world have the most public debt. I'm going to be using as a criteria the debt to GDP ratio because I think this is the best indicator to understand how heavy a country's debt really is. Some small countries might have very low values of debt, but they also have minuscule GDPs, which stop them from ever being able to pay it back, while others might have huge debts but very sizable GDPs, which make those values manageable. Essentially, countries with low debt to GDP ratios have economies which produce and sell enough goods and services to be able to pay back their loans without incurring further debt. So now let's jump right into it. Which are the 10 countries worldwide with the most public debt? Remember, this is always referring to debt as a percentage of GDP, and I'm using the data from the International Monetary Fund from 2021. First is Japan with a debt of 256%, Sudan at 209, Greece at 206, Eritrea at 175, Cabo Verde at 160%, Italy at 154, Suriname at 140, Barbados with 138, Singapore 137, and the Maldives 137 also. Although it's important to point out that all countries on this list up to 17th place have debts above 100% of their GDP. Portugal, for instance, has 130%, the USA have 133, Spain 120, France 115%, and the UK 108. Before we keep going with the video, a quick message about today's sponsor, MorningBrew. MorningBrew is a fantastic daily newsletter. Do you ever miss those times when the newspaper guy would come over to your house with a morning paper? Well, me neither, because I wasn't alive back then, but it does seem like a cool concept. MorningBrew is the modern version of that. Every morning you wake up, Monday to Sunday, check your email, and there it is. A quick, summarized, and interesting gathering of all the important business world news. I was just reading in one of the latest issues about how Elon Musk plans to sell $21 billion of Tesla stock because of a Twitter poll he decided to run. As crazy as it sounds, in a connected world, it's pretty hard to stay informed on the news via a reliable source. TV news are dense and repetitive, online newspapers are stuck behind paywalls, and you really don't want to be getting your news off of social media. The best thing about MorningBrew is that it's not only a reliable source, but it's free. So if you want to, there's really no reason not to sign up. It's free and it's great. Click the link in the description below to get it sent to your inbox and become more informed every day. Now getting back to the video. This interactive data map from the IMF website is really great to learn about this. We can instinctively see which countries have the most debt percentage by color scale, and we can move around and hover over each of them. There's sadly some missing data for a few, most surprisingly Argentina. Any countries over the 50% mark are in orange, ones below 50% are in green. Although I would argue the only ones that should be concerned are the ones in darker orange from 75% upwards, but there's still a lot of those. And in fact, I was honestly surprised by how many countries still have reasonably low national debts. In America, the US and Canada are clearly the worst. In Europe, the West and South are the ones doing not so good. In Africa, they're spread all around, and in Asia, Eastern countries have the most debt. Since we started by listing the ones with the most debt, what about the ones with the least? Worldwide, the ones with the least amount of debt seem to be Macau with 0% and Hong Kong with 2%. Although these might be somewhat unfair since they aren't technically countries and China itself may take over their debt, Brunei only has 2.3%, Tuvalu at 6%, and Kuwait at 7.9%. The Democratic Republic of the Congo has 11.9%, the Marshall Islands 14.4%, Micronesia 15.1%, and Timor-Leste 16.5%. But these are all somewhat small countries, except the Congo. Which of the biggest ones have little debt? Russia definitely stands out, with one of the biggest economies in the world and having a debt equivalent to only 17.9% of its GDP. Estonia only has 20%, Botswana 22%, and Bulgaria 25%. Luxembourg is close at 26.3% and Taiwan at 27.2%. So why do some countries have such a big amount of debt while others are able to keep it small? The biggest argument is the economy size and the robustness of it. If a country generates a lot of money, then it won't need to borrow it. That makes sense. But it's not enough to explain these values. Japan has one of the biggest economies in the world, and yet it has the biggest debt percentage worldwide. And as we'll see in a little bit, the reason for that debt percentage might precisely be their successful economy. Portugal also has a reasonably strong economy, and yet its debt is also very high. So let's try to understand why some of these cases are that way, how debt values have evolved throughout time, and what the causes of some increases might have been. The IMF website presents us with a view of countries' debt throughout time. Worldwide data only began filling out in around 2001, so let's start there and take a quick look over the past 20 years. The general perception, at least from me, is that save a few exceptions, from 2001 to 2007, the tendency was debt reduction, or GDP growth, but at least a reduction in the debt percentage. In 2008, the financial crisis began, and especially in the US and Europe, public debt began to grow. By 2012, this effect seems to have spread to the rest of the world, and from then until now, it seems that global economies have been going more and more into debt. It's very visible. We can see the green increase pretty much everywhere, especially Africa, from 2001 to 2008, and then the orange beginning to take over all around from 2008 onwards. And here we begin to understand that specific events throughout history have caused booms of the public debt percentages, sometimes then being reverted with time if countries managed to solve their issues or did not have underlying ones. For instance, in 1815, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the British government debt reached a peak of more than 200% of the GDP. This person on Reddit, Pie Chart Pirate, creates these incredible animated flowcharts showing countries' debt values throughout history, marking the key events that triggered increases or decreases. In this one of the UK, we can see how the values were around 30% until World War I, rising a lot in that period, with a gigantic growth during World War II as well, and then beginning a downwards recovery trajectory all the way until the global financial crisis of 2008 to 12, where debt began to increase again. In this other chart, we can see the evolution of G7 economies' debts from 2006 to 2016. All of them increased with the exception of Germany. And the current health issues the world has been facing in the past couple of years will and have also had an impact on state economies and consequently their debts, because these events are of such great magnitude that the entire world's economy suffers from it. In this other chart, limited to some European countries, we can also see this debt to GDP ratio evolution. Most of the countries started the century in the green or even in the blue, with values under 20% or at least in the 50 to 60% area, with the exceptions of Italy, Belgium, and Greece, which seem to have always struggled with this. An interesting case is Bulgaria, which started off particularly bad with a 97% debt ratio in 1997 and has managed to reduce it to 26% by 2017. They even hit a low of 13% in 2008. I have no idea how this was possible. If you know, please let me know in the comments. The IMF projection until 2026 is essentially that the current situation will maintain itself with a slight worsening of values, save a few exceptions of countries that will be able to reduce their debt. So why do countries go into debt? Like we saw, it has a lot to do with international events, but internal ones may also have a big impact. The United States have more government debt than any other country, despite not having the biggest debt to GDP ratio. The US government found itself in debt for the first time in 1790, following the Revolutionary War. And while the value has gone down throughout the country's history, it's recently gone back up a lot. This graph from the Pew Research Center is really good to have this perception of countries that have high debt in terms terms of how much money they owe, and others who don't have that much, but it still corresponds to a high percentage of their GDP, or both. In general, US debt increases as a result of increased government spending and decreased income through less corporate or individual taxes. Japan, like we saw earlier, has the highest percentage-wise and fairly high in value itself too. So why? It seems to have started with World War II. After the war, Japan was completely destroyed, and it had to be rebuilt with the help of a recovery program. After this, their economy exploded, having 10% gains a year. Their internal market grew more and more, but then the bubble burst, and in around 1992, their stock market fell 30,000 points. I don't know what that means, honestly, but falling 30,000 points in anything doesn't sound good. Their fiscal policy promoted loans at initially a very low interest rate, and this led to more and more growth in debt up to today. In Portugal, for instance, growing debt had been a little bit of an issue since the early 90s, but it became more aggravated with the 2012 financial crisis. The difficulties experienced by the country's banking sector required state intervention, and this intervention in turn led to a government debt crisis. And in Italy, the debt is a legacy of the 1980s, when the Minister of the Treasury and the Governor of the Bank of Italy signed a divorce between the two institutions before the bank had to buy the government's bonds that were not placed on the market, and so it assumed the burden of financing the state. Basically, the bank was assuring the success of government bonds auctions by printing the money necessary to buy the unsold bonds. When they stopped, it started going wrong, and at this time the oil crisis also took place, which boosted inflation all over the world, and the Bank of Italy ended up devaluing the lira by 40%. A set of not so good financial policy decisions and poor international context led to a large debt issue until today. In summary, it seems that the countries with the most debt usually have it because of issues with their economy and or poor choices regarding their financial policies. These are therefore more fragile and vulnerable when international problems happen that lead to a growth in debt worldwide, while others will be able to push through them and overcome them. These fragile or sometimes just smaller economies will not, due to their previous issues. When you have debt, you have to pay it off throughout time, and you do so by paying the amount you borrowed plus interest rates. These interest rates vary. I won't get into what they're based on or how they're calculated throughout time, but a country can pay more or less depending on the deal that they made when they borrowed and on the current state of their economy. Brazil, for instance, seems to be the country in the world that pays the most amount of interest on their debt, followed by Spain and Iceland. Usually, high debt risk happens when countries are, in theory, more at risk of not paying their debts. This is, however, somewhat unfair in my opinion, as it is very rare for national debts to be left unpaid, and this way countries that struggle economically are forever stuck in this negative financial loop. There's only a handful of examples of countries that actually defaulted on their debt, meaning they didn't pay it, like North Korea in 1987, Russia in 98, and Argentina in 2002, and all of them had very negative internal consequences. So, those are the countries in the world with the most and least public debt. What this debt is, how it is created, how and why it increases, and how it can diminish. What the evolution of debt to GDP ratios has been throughout time, and how that has varied depending on world events as well as government policies. Thanks so much for watching this video. Subscribe if you want and leave a comment with your opinion about this. I will see you next time for more general knowledge.